It's that time of the week again where we look at investment on the continent. Hello, I'm Nozi Pombandra and this is Invest Africa. Thank you for making the time to join us. Now, education is the key to success, or so we're told. But as the lock changes, the traditional key is becoming increasingly obsolete. Just like the adage that we require African solutions for Africa, education is a domain that needs to be redressed with a local perspective. In Africa, traditional classroom education is not always possible, and with the burgeoning population, new solutions need to be adapted to provide real education. But what are the options for Africa, and do these options present a unique investment opportunity? Looking globally, UNESCO tells us that education prospects for children are at risk. Let's take a look at the global picture in a little bit more depth. We see here that about 57 million children are currently out of school, but perhaps what is also more worrying is that of this 57 million, 31 million of these are girl children. In addition to that, almost half of these children, 49%, will probably never set foot in a classroom. But the story is just not all doom and gloom. There are pockets of excellence and pockets of positivity. If we turn our focus to South and West Asia, we see that they've actually managed to reduce the number of children that are out of school in the decade between 1999 and 2011. Moving forward, the general trend that emerges is the fact that the rate of out-of-school children and bringing that number down is not progressing at a pace that is fast enough. We also see that the attrition rate, that is the number of children who are actually dropping out of school, currently sits at 25%. And we're talking about primary school. The number gets much higher as we progress to secondary and tertiary education. At a sub-Saharan African level, looking at the region, we see that more than 7 out of 10 of the countries that we have on the continent, that 70% of the countries on the continent actually do not have enough education skills in terms of teachers to actually occupy the classroom. What this means, though, given the fact that we have a growing population, is that we need to create at least 6.2 million more teacher vacancies by 2030. And of the 6.2 million, at the very least, 2.3 million have to be absolutely new positions, so not actually tapping in to the existing skills capacity that the continent has. This is the kind of challenge that education and alternate education has to face up to. Joining me now to discuss alternate education in Africa is Josh Elder. He's the Chief Academic Officer at Pioneer Academies. And in Johannesburg, we're also joined by Mabuto Mthembu. He's a KPMG Senior Manager and the Chairperson of the Youth Managers Foundation. And from Nigeria, we're joined by Dr. Enasi Okonedo. She's the Dean of the Lagos Business School. Now, for you at home, if you'd like to be a part of this conversation, you can certainly do that. That's by following me at Nozi Pombandra or at CNBC Africa. And of course, the hashtag for this show is Invest Africa. Let's maybe start off in Nigeria. Dr. Enasi, let's come to you and maybe get you just to remind us between the link between traditional education and alternative education. What are the fundamental differences between these two approaches?
Well, when we talk about traditional education, we talk about the ways that all through the centuries people have been educated, which is that you come to a classroom setting and you're taught by somebody who sort of talks down to you. It's a more authoritarian style of learning because this person is presenting to you what knowledge it has and hoping that by such transmission you'll be able to get it and work with it.
Josh, you're one of the players in terms of alternate education here in South Africa. What are you offering that the traditional school is not offering?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're really trying to push for in the alternative education movement is really a real focus on problem solving and critical thinking, trying to move away from the rote memorization and the lecture style that I think most of us probably grew up with in our traditional education sense, and really giving students the opportunity to really push themselves to learn how to be the next best thinkers and really think critically and problem solve to set them up for success in the future.
Mabuto, if you just take a step back and look at the general trends in terms of alternative education versus traditional education, are we seeing a big shift in terms of parents looking at alternative models? What does the landscape look like?
I don't think we are seeing any big shift. And I mean, you would acknowledge that majority, I mean, you've just shared with us very disturbing statistics in relation to sub-Saharan Africa. But the majority of the learners go to, to poor schools, they come from disadvantaged backgrounds, etc. And really the shift should be, because majority of those learners that we're talking about are not from the, from the good schools, they're from the bad schools. And the reality is that what needs to happen is that parents need to be involved as well in terms of education. So we need to shift away from the definition of a narrow-minded type of education, where education is seen as a lecture type of education that happens at school. But education needs to start at a very young age, and it needs to start at home. And therefore, parents have a very critical role to play in relation to that.
Problematic concept that Mabuto puts on the table, the good school and the bad school. Let's talk about how we shift that perception, because there is a perception that if a school is state-funded, i.e. is it a government school, it falls into the category of a bad school. To what extent does that perception continue to fester?
I definitely think it's the perception that still exists. And I think that's one of the things that we're trying to really push for, is a collaboration amongst the so-called public sector and the private sector of schooling, where if it's a government school, it is deemed to sometimes be the bad school, and the private schools are deemed to be the so-called good schools. So I really think it's the sense of fostering the collaboration to really provide the equity that exists, and really push best teaching practices and create learning opportunities that can transcend regardless of what school environment that you exist in.
Dr. Enasi, let's maybe just balance this conversation against the social outcomes that education is expected to meet. This is about access, this is about equity. Are alternative models to education locking out vast populations of students who cannot afford to be attending these schools?
Oh, certainly. It's looking at that there. So, in fact, a minute ago when we're talking about the good school and the bad school, I thought perhaps we were falling into the mode of thinking that education has to happen within a school. And I think that when we talk about alternative models, we look beyond education happening within the schools because of the constraints, some of which have been identified. The number of school-age kids that need an education, and the limits to funding and the physical development of such schools as well there. So alternative education does provide a means by which we can educate people without them necessarily coming to the school. And the various models, some of which have been used across Africa lately over the last few years, that bring education to those people that ordinarily will not get access to schools, either for lack of opportunity, on account of their being in rural areas, or just constraints to the number of schools that are available in the environment.
Mabuto, we're seeing a shift in this conversation in terms of education being seen as a government responsibility. There's a new space that's opening up that says the private sector can be an active participant in terms of delivering this particular service. Is there money to be made from education?
In terms of the private sector involvement, I wouldn't advocate, for, privatization of education, because we will lock out sort of a lot of young people in Africa because of affordability issues and so forth. But in terms of private sector involvement, I would rather advocate for the private sector that gets involved in the public education, and they need to be driven by sustainability. So we need to move away from a situation where when the private sector gets involved, it only just donates things and it leaves them and it goes and so forth.
Let's drill down into that sustainability approach that you're putting on the table. What exactly do you mean by saying the private sector should be driven by sustainability?
Sustainability, in my understanding and in my view, is that what you see happening is that the private sector does to some extent donate certain things or infrastructure, equipment to schools. And what happens is that they donate and they never come back to check whether what they have donated is being utilized and so forth. So we have seen a lot of donations going into the school, but what you experience is non-utilization of those donations that are received from the private sector, and therefore then it's not sustainable and it's not impactful, and it doesn't add any value to our education system. So we need we need a private sector that will take ownership of the education system in terms of whatever role that they are playing in terms of donations, they are able to actually make a meaningful impact through
So we have different understandings of ownership, and I think you raise an important question. I want both Josh and Dr. Enesi to pick this up. Josh, Mabuto is saying that privatization of education in Africa is not necessarily a good thing. You're privatizing education. Why are you doing such a bad thing?
Great question. I really think for Pioneer Academies, the thing that we're trying to do, be in the private sector and going into education, is really to provide access of quality education and make it affordable. And I definitely agree with the comment around that a lot of the private sector will donate things and they don't necessarily follow through. And I think that's why for us at Pioneer, it's not just about donating. It's really about creating an education institution that really is going to transform education. So we're not just donating supplies or materials, but we really are putting in the investment and the human capital to make sure we provide an alternative learning experience, not only for our learners, but also for the teachers, because I think that's a space where alternative education also should go as the teacher transformation practice.
Dr. Nasi, I'm going to ask you to please play referee for me on this one. What should the role of the private sector be in the provision of education? Should it be to support the government in terms of playing a sustainable role, or should we see the private sector at the forefront investing and looking for profitable returns out of the sector?
Well, I think that it should be more of a supporting role. I don't think that we should look at private sector investment in terms of investment and getting a financial return back. It is an investment to the extent that there are social benefits that are going to come to it that ultimately benefit society. But all too often, what we see, especially in Nigeria, is that because of the perceived low quality of state-funded education, people create alternative education, alternative schools in order to get a financial benefit. I think that takes away from what it is that we should be looking to do in terms of education. What we should be looking to do and the benefits that we should be seeking to gain are that by educating a wider populace there, we're contributing to the development of society, we're creating a pool of individuals who can ultimately work within organizations, developing talents for Africa. I don't think that that is something that the private sector should do on its own. If we look at the number and the percentages, 80% of the schools are government and state-funded schools, 20% to education. Given the rising population, there's just no way the private sector can do it on its own. Therefore, they can't support the efforts there. And I don't think that that support comes through donations. It's more working together to, in the words that have just been said, look for a sustainable way to educate the populace.
Josh, I'm going to let you take a rebuttal before we go to break. What is the gap that a player like Pioneer Academies is actually trying to fill, if the view that we're hearing today is that this is the sole preserve of the state and the private sector can be brought in as a complementary partner and not a leading investor?
I think for Pioneer, we really want to foster that sense of collaboration, and I think the gap that we're trying to fill in the space is really just to provide equality in education for the students, really to get them to be successful, prepare them for life. We don't really know what opportunities exist in their future, and so it's much different than when we were going to school. So for us, it's truly about giving them the opportunity to be successful, not just preparing them for the test, but really preparing them for life. And so we really encourage both the private and public sector to work together, because I think we're right, we can't do it alone. We really need to foster a sense of togetherness in order to provide the best possible learning opportunities and education future for the students out there.
A sense of togetherness, that's where we're going to leave it for now. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, more on alternative education in Africa. Do stay with us.